My name is Nia Jackson, 32 years old and the architect of my own empire. 3 days before my younger sister Chloe was set to have the most lavish engagement party our family had ever seen. My mother Valerie slid my white gift envelope back across the polished marble island of her kitchen. She did not even look me in the eye when she said it. She just kept arranging her imported hydrangeas and told me I was not allowed to attend. She said Preston, Chloe's fiancé, came from a very prominent old money-white family, and my presence would ruin the aesthetic. She told me my off-the-rack corporate suits and boring accountant lifestyle would embarrass them in front of the elite crowd they were trying so desperately to impress. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I simply nodded, pushed the envelope back onto the counter, and walked out the front door. My mother thought she was rejecting a meager cash gift from her disappointing daughter. What she did not know was that the envelope contained the fully paid-off deed to the very house she was standing in, a house I had secretly saved from foreclosure 5 years earlier. And what my sister and her arrogant fiancé did not know was that exactly 1 week after that engagement party, their world would shatter. They would walk into the top-floor boardroom of Vanguard Capital in downtown Manhattan, sweating and desperate to secure a $50 million investment to save Preston's crumbling real estate firm. They expected to pitch their lives to a faceless and ruthless private equity billionaire. When the glass doors opened, the person sitting at the head of that massive table, the CEO and sole owner holding their entire future in her hands, was me. Before I continue this story of family betrayal, toxic favoritism, and the ultimate hostile takeover, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly build your kingdom, while the people who should have loved you underestimated your worth. To understand how we reached that explosive moment in the boardroom, you have to understand the dynamic of the Jackson family. Growing up in a rapidly gentrifying historic Black neighborhood in Brooklyn, my mother Valerie treated our home like a country club where she was the president and I was the help. Chloe, 4 years my junior, was the undisputed golden child. With her flawless looks, charismatic charm, and endless demands for the finer things, Chloe was everything my mother valued. My mother was heavily involved in various elite social clubs for upper-class women, places where appearances were the only currency that mattered. She spent her days obsessing over status designer labels and climbing the social ladder. I was the exact opposite. I was quiet, deeply observant, and obsessed with numbers. While Chloe was busy convincing our parents to buy her the latest designer bags, I was studying market trends and reading financial reports in my bedroom. My mother constantly belittled my interests. She called me a glorified calculator. She told her friends I was just a lowly number cruncher who lacked the elegance and spark required to marry well or make a real name for myself. I learned early on that my worth in her eyes was directly tied to how much I could elevate her social standing, which meant I was essentially worthless to her. When Chloe brought Preston Caldwell home, my mother practically threw a parade. Preston was a real estate developer from a wealthy family with deep old money ties. To Valerie, Preston was the ultimate prize, the golden ticket that would finally cement her status among the elite. She ignored his condescending tone, the way he constantly talked over our father Marcus, and the subtle microaggressions he masked as jokes. All she saw was his trust fund and his country club memberships. Preston looked at me the way one looks at a smudge on a clean window. To him, I was just the frumpy, invisible sister with a dead-end desk job. They all bought into the false narrative my mother had created. None of them bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. None of them knew that the quiet girl they constantly dismissed had spent the last decade building Vanguard Capital from the ground up, turning a modest investment fund into a multi-million-dollar private equity powerhouse that controlled vast amounts of commercial real estate across the city. The isolation I felt within my own family was a heavy burden, but it also became my greatest advantage. Because they expected nothing from me, they never saw me coming. The confrontation in the kitchen was the final breaking point. It was a Tuesday afternoon, when my mother called me over supposedly to help her organize the caterer invoices for the party. Instead, she waited until my father was out of the house to deliver her crushing blow. The sheer coldness in her voice as she slid that envelope back to me was something I will never forget. She told me to stay away, to let Chloe have her perfect, unblemished night among high society. She said I simply did not fit into the new wealthy world they were entering. I remember looking around that kitchen, looking at the expensive marble renovations she had charged to credit cards she could not afford, and feeling a profound sense of finality. I realized then that no amount of loyalty or financial support would ever make her love me the way she loved the idea of Preston Caldwell's wealth. I walked out of that house with my head held high, knowing the clock was ticking. I went straight back to my penthouse apartment, poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, and sat on my sofa in the dim light. Surrounded by contemporary art that cost more than Preston's entire wedding budget, I looked out over the glowing Manhattan skyline. The engagement party was just a meaningless warm-up. The real event was going to happen in my boardroom, and I was ready to watch their fragile empire shatter like glass. "Nia, just where do you think you are going so fast?" It was my mother, Valerie. She detached herself from a group of wealthy older women and marched toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet. Her face was set in that familiar tight mask of disapproval she always wore when looking at me. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of my suit jacket, and pulled me a few steps back into the hallway away from the prying eyes of the Caldwell family. "Look at you," Valerie hissed under her breath. "Could you not have bothered to put on something decent? You look like you are here to serve the appetizers. I told your father to just get the necklace himself, but of course he had to drag you here." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "I brought the necklace, Mother. The crisis has been averted. You are welcome. Now I have to get back to the office." Valerie scoffed a bitter sound that she quickly disguised as a cough when a waiter walked past. "The office, right. Tell me, do the spreadsheets miss you? Because honestly, Nia, nobody here does. You being here looking like a glorified tax auditor is an embarrassment. Chloe is marrying into the Caldwell family, the Caldwells. They own half the commercial real estate in the tri-state area. They do not need to see my other daughter looking like she barely scrapes by on a number cruncher salary. You are ruining the entire aesthetic of this event." Just as my mother was finishing her venomous tirade, a tall man stepped out from the main suite and approached us. It was Preston Caldwell. He moved with that unmistakable lazy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He wore a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my father made in a month, his blonde hair perfectly styled. He slipped one hand into his pocket and looked down at me with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain. "Is everything all right here, Valerie?" Preston asked, his voice smooth but carrying a sharp edge of condescension. "I saw you pull this woman aside. If the catering staff is giving you trouble, I can have the hotel manager come up right away." My mother immediately transformed. Her rigid posture melted into a fawning, overly eager stance. She offered a high-pitched artificial laugh. "Oh, Preston, no. No trouble at all. This is just my older daughter, Nia. She was just dropping something off for her father and was about to leave." Preston raised an eyebrow, his pale eyes slowly looking me up and down. He took in my lack of designer labels, my sensible shoes, and my plain briefcase. His gaze held no respect, only a casual dismissal. He did not see a woman who owned a private equity firm. He saw someone beneath him, someone who did not fit into the carefully curated, wealthy white world he inhabited. "Ah, the elusive sister," Preston said, letting out a short, mocking chuckle. "Chloe mentioned you worked in an office somewhere. Accounting was it very practical. We always need people to balance the books for us." I looked right back at him. I did not blink. I noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the subtle signs of stress behind his arrogant facade. I knew things about his company's financial health that even his own board of directors did not know yet. But I stayed completely silent, letting him dig his own grave. Preston reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a silver money clip, thick with cash. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill. With a patronizing smile, he held it out to me, snapping the heavy paper between his fingers. "Here," Preston said, his tone dripping with fake generosity. "Why do you not take this and catch a cab back to the hood or wherever it is you live? We are about to start the formal family portraits, and you really do not fit the aesthetic we are going for today. Treat yourself to a nice dinner on your way home." My mother gasped softly, but she did not defend me. Instead, she looked away, her silence screaming her complicity. She would rather watch a white man humiliate her own flesh and blood than risk upsetting her golden child's ticket to high society. She was so desperate for proximity to his perceived power that she willingly sacrificed me at his altar. I looked at the $100 bill extended toward me. Any other person might have slapped his hand away. Any other woman might have raised her voice, caused a scene, and given them exactly what they wanted, the angry out-of-place relative ruining the sophisticated gathering. But I was not any other woman. I operated on a different frequency. I knew that true power does not need to scream to be heard. I slowly reached out and took the crisp bill from his fingers. I folded it deliberately and tucked it neatly into the pocket of my blazer. I looked up at Preston Caldwell, meeting his arrogant smirk with a terrifyingly calm smile of my own. "Thank you, Preston," I said, my voice steady and smooth. "That is very generous of you. I will be sure to put this exactly where it belongs." Preston seemed slightly unsettled by my lack of outrage, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, turning his back to me to face my mother. "See that she finds the service elevator, Valerie," he muttered, already walking away. "We need you inside for the toast." My mother gave me one last warning glare before hurrying after him like an obedient servant. I stood in the plush hallway for a moment longer, feeling the heavy fabric of the $100 bill in my pocket. It was a tangible reminder of their blinding ignorance. They were so consumed by the illusion of their superiority that they had completely failed to recognize the predator standing right in front of them. I turned on my heel and walked down the long, carpeted corridor. I did not take the service elevator. I took the main glass elevator down to the lobby, walking with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who owned her world. I stepped out through the revolving doors of the Plaza Hotel and into the crisp New York air. My driver was waiting by the curb, holding open the door of my black town car. I climbed into the quiet luxury of the leather interior. As the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the heavy city traffic, I took the $100 bill out of my pocket and placed it on the armrest. I stared at it, the corners of my mouth lifting into a genuine smile for the first time all day. Preston Caldwell thought he was dismissing a peasant. He had no idea he had just handed a tip to his executioner. I pulled out my phone, opening a direct line to my lead acquisitions director at Vanguard Capital. I typed a single decisive message. "Prepare the Caldwell real estate portfolio for immediate review on Monday morning. I want every toxic asset and outstanding loan flagged. We are going to bleed them dry." The weekend passed in a blur of focused anticipation. I spent my time in my glass corner office tearing apart the crumbling foundation of Preston Caldwell's supposed empire. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, undeniable clarity. It was time for the real introduction. The Vanguard Capital building stood as a monolith of steel and tinted glass in the heart of the financial district. It was not a place of loud, desperate socializing like the Plaza Hotel. It was a cathedral of modern commerce, a fortress where billions of dollars were moved quietly across the globe with the stroke of a keyboard. The lobby was a vast expanse of polished black marble, brushed chrome, and towering indoor water features that masked the sound of footsteps. There was no chaotic chatter here, only the sharp clicking of leather shoes and the low hum of calculated power. This was my domain. I had built it from nothing, and every inch of it reflected my exact specifications. At exactly 9:45 that Monday morning, Preston Caldwell and my sister Chloe pushed through the heavy revolving doors. I was standing near the secure elevator banks holding a cup of black coffee, casually reviewing a digital summary on my tablet. From my vantage point, I could observe them perfectly. Preston looked different than he had at the hotel. His arrogant swagger was still there, but it was stiff. He was wearing another impeccable tailored suit, carrying an expensive leather portfolio, but the slight tension in his shoulders and the way he tightly gripped the handle betrayed him. I knew exactly why he was sweating. My intelligence team had spent the entire weekend verifying his financial ruin. His real estate firm was drowning in toxic debt, bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. He needed the $50 million injection from Vanguard Capital to prevent a total public collapse. Chloe, on the other hand, was completely oblivious to her fiancé's impending bankruptcy. She strutted into the lobby as if it were a runway dripping in visible designer logos. She wore a bright pink Chanel tweed suit that screamed new money and held onto Preston's arm like a shiny accessory. She was treating this life-saving corporate pitch like a fun morning errand before a spa appointment. As they approached the main reception desk, Chloe turned her head and caught sight of me standing near the security turnstiles. She stopped dead in her tracks. A look of profound confusion washed over her perfectly contoured face, quickly replaced by a wide, mocking smile. She let go of Preston's arm and practically trotted over to me, her heels echoing loudly and inappropriately against the marble floor. Preston followed closely behind, looking highly irritated by the delay. "Nia, what on earth are you doing here?" Chloe asked, her voice echoing too loudly in the hushed lobby. "Did you get lost on your way to the subway?" I calmly lowered my tablet and looked at her. "I am exactly where I need to be, Chloe." "Good morning to you, too." Chloe let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored but unbranded charcoal suit. "Oh, I get it. Did your little accounting firm let you go? Are you here dropping off your resume? I heard these big investment firms are always looking for data entry clerks and receptionists. Or maybe you are applying for the janitorial staff. Honestly, with that outfit, you could easily blend in with the night shift maintenance crew." Preston checked his heavy gold watch, sighing impatiently. "Chloe, we do not have time for this. We have a 10 o'clock meeting with the CEO of Vanguard Capital. A very important meeting." He finally looked directly at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he remembered our interaction at the hotel. "Look, Nia," he said, using the same patronizing tone from 3 days ago. "This is a serious corporate environment. People here deal in high-level finance, not whatever petty bookkeeping you are used to. If you are here begging for a secretarial job, do us all a favor and wait until we are done with our pitch. I do not want the executives associating my company with someone like you. It throws off the professional aesthetic I am trying to maintain." The sheer audacity of his ignorance was almost intoxicating. He was standing in the lobby of my building mere minutes away from begging for his financial life, and he was still trying to put me in my place. He truly believed that his whiteness, his gender, and his fabricated old money background made him the undisputed master of any room he walked into. He thought he was untouchable. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat. I looked at Preston, keeping my expression pleasantly blank. "I appreciate the career advice, Preston. But you really should not worry about me ruining your aesthetic today. I think you have much bigger things to focus on. Your 10 o'clock meeting, for instance. I hear the CEO of Vanguard can be incredibly demanding when it comes to reviewing corporate debt to equity ratios." Preston sneered, clearly annoyed that I even knew what a debt-to-equity ratio was. "Just stay out of our way," he muttered. "Come on, Chloe." Chloe gave me a fake, pitying pout. "Good luck with the job hunt, Nia. Let me know if you need to borrow a nicer outfit for your interviews. I have some old dresses I was going to donate to charity anyway." She turned and looped her arm back through Preston's. Together they walked toward the sprawling reception desk. I watched as the head of security, a man who had worked exclusively for me for 5 years, caught my eye. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He immediately understood the assignment. He approached Preston and Chloe, asking for their identification with cold professional efficiency. He handed them their visitor badges, the cheap plastic kind we reserved for external vendors, and directed them toward the standard guest elevators. I did not follow them. I turned and walked toward the private elevator bank concealed behind a wall of frosted glass. The heavy doors slid open automatically as I approached, scanning my biometric profile. I stepped into the mahogany-paneled cab and pressed the single glowing button for the top floor. The ride up was silent and swift. I watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher, leaving the lobby and my sister's petty insults far below. They thought they were taking an elevator to their salvation. They had no idea they were riding straight into a slaughterhouse. By the time they reached the boardroom, I would already be waiting at the head of the table. The Vanguard Capital boardroom was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline, but inside the temperature was kept precisely at 68 degrees. A massive table carved from a single piece of tempered glass and brushed steel dominated the space. I sat at the head of that table in a high-backed leather chair, my hands neatly folded over a thick leather-bound dossier. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy mahogany double doors swung open. My executive assistant, a sharply dressed man named David, ushered them in. Preston walked in first, adjusting his tie, wearing his best $1 million smile, ready to charm whichever old white billionaire he assumed was running the firm. Chloe trailed slightly behind him, looking around the room with wide, greedy eyes, taking in the sheer scale of the wealth on display. Preston turned his attention to the head of the table. His smile froze. The blood drained from his face so quickly, he looked like he might physically collapse. He stopped walking entirely. Chloe bumped into his arm. She looked up annoyed, and then followed his gaze to me. Chloe let out an exasperated sigh, her voice laced with heavy irritation. "Nia, what are you doing in here? Did security not kick you out of the building yet? Get out of the CEO's chair before you get arrested. Are you setting up the water glasses or something?" I did not move. I did not blink. I just looked at my assistant. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a newly sharpened blade. "Please hold all my calls for the next 20 minutes. David nodded respectfully. "Yes, Ms. Jackson." He stepped out and pulled the heavy doors shut, leaving the three of us completely alone. The click of the heavy lock echoed loudly in the large room. Preston swallowed hard. His arrogant posture from the lobby had completely evaporated. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing he had walked directly into a trap. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "You are the CEO of Vanguard Capital." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass table. "I am the founder, the CEO, and the majority shareholder, Preston. Welcome to my boardroom. Please take a seat. We have a $50 million proposal to discuss." Chloe let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Preston, what is going on? Is this a joke? Nia works in a cubicle. She does not own this building." Preston did not look at her. He slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. His eyes locked on mine, his mind clearly racing as he realized the magnitude of his fatal mistake. Chloe, sensing the drastic shift in the atmosphere, tentatively sat down next to him. Her bright pink Chanel suit suddenly looked very small and entirely ridiculous in my space. I reached into my leather dossier and pulled out the glossy, professionally bound pitch deck they had submitted a week prior. It was filled with pretty graphics, bold buzzwords, and highly optimistic projections. I tossed it across the slick glass table. It slid smoothly, stopping perfectly right in front of Preston's trembling hands. "Let us skip the rehearsed presentation," I said. "I spent my entire weekend reviewing your financials, Preston, and I have to say it is quite a creative work of fiction." Preston tried to puff out his chest, desperately reaching for the authority he usually wielded so easily against women like my mother and sister. "Now listen here, Nia. You are misinterpreting the data. Commercial real estate development is about long-term leverage. Our portfolio has historical value that your basic algorithms are not factoring in. If you just let me explain the corporate restructuring plan." There is no restructuring plan. I cut him off smoothly, denying him the space to spin his lies. There is only a desperate man trying to plug a sinking ship with other people's money. Your revenue projections are inflated by 40%. You are hiding massive liabilities off the balance sheet using 3 different shell companies registered in Delaware. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. I am not finished. Your flagship commercial property in Midtown is currently operating at a negative cash flow because you cannot retain your corporate tenants. You have a balloon payment of $30 million due to a private lender in exactly 14 days, and you only have $2 million in liquid assets across all your corporate accounts. Your real estate empire is not experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. It is completely underwater. You are bleeding capital. You are bankrupt in everything but name. He stared at the pitch deck, his hands gripping the edge of the glass table until his knuckles turned pure white. He had leveraged his family name and his old money aesthetic to get those initial loans, but a wealthy last name does not pay the interest when the properties sit empty. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the man who had handed me $100 bill and told me to take a cab back to the hood. You came to my firm asking for a $50 million lifeline, presenting this company as a premium investment opportunity. But I deal in facts, Preston, not aesthetics. Your company is nothing but garbage wrapped in silk. Vanguard Capital formally denies your request for funding. We will not be investing a single cent into your sinking ship. The silence that followed was deafening. The reality of his absolute ruin hung heavy in the air. Then Chloe snapped. She jumped out of her chair, her face flushed red with rage and humiliation. She slammed her hands flat on the glass table. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. "You are just doing this to be vindictive. You are jealous of me. You have always been jealous of me and Preston. You are going to ruin my wedding." I looked at my sister, watching her throw a childish tantrum in the middle of a corporate war room. She was hyperventilating the carefully constructed illusion of her perfect wealthy life, shattering into a million sharp pieces right before her eyes. "I am doing this because it is bad business, Chloe," I replied with zero emotion. "I do not finance failures. And as for your lavish wedding, I suggest you check if the caterer has cashed the deposit check yet. Because judging by your fiancé's actual bank statements, his credit cards are about to start bouncing very soon. Now both of you get out of my office." Preston did not waste any time. By the time he and Chloe reached the ground floor of my building, he was already spinning an intricate web of lies. He convinced my sister that my financial analysis was completely fabricated, a vindictive narrative born out of deep-seated jealousy. He told her that his company was perfectly healthy, merely experiencing a minor cash flow hiccup due to delayed international wire transfers. Because Chloe's entire identity was wrapped up in the illusion of his wealth, she swallowed the lie without hesitation. They immediately went straight to my mother. Valerie, desperate to protect her golden ticket into high society, bought into his story entirely. She saw me not as a successful business owner protecting her assets, but as an evil, bitter woman trying to sabotage her perfect daughter. The summons came early Friday morning. It was not a phone call but a brief cold text message from my mother. It simply read, "Sunday dinner at 3. Be here. We are resolving this family matter." In our community, Sunday dinner after church is a sacred institution. It is usually a time for gathering, sharing food, and reinforcing family bonds. But in my mother's house, the dining table had always been a courtroom where she served as the judge, jury, and executioner. I could have ignored the message. I should have ignored it. But a part of me wanted to look them in the eye and see exactly how far their delusion went. I wanted to see if there was any limit to my mother's willingness to sacrifice me for Chloe's benefit. I arrived at my parents' house precisely at 3. The heavy, comforting scent of roasted chicken, candied yams, and baked macaroni and cheese hung in the air, a stark contrast to the absolute hostility waiting for me in the dining room. I walked in wearing a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, projecting the calm energy of a woman who had absolutely nothing to prove. They were all already seated around the large oak table. My father Marcus looked down at his plate, completely refusing to meet my eyes. He was a good man, but he was a coward when it came to his wife. Chloe was sitting aggressively close to Preston, holding his hand tightly, glaring at me, as if I were a trespasser in my own childhood home. Preston wore a soft, wounded expression, playing the role of the victimized gentleman to absolute perfection. My mother sat at the head of the table. Her posture was rigid, her hands folded tightly over a linen napkin. There was no greeting. There were no congratulations on the fact that her supposedly mediocre daughter had secretly built a multi-million-dollar empire right under her nose. Valerie did not ask how I managed to keep such a massive achievement hidden or express a single ounce of pride in my success. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger at the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, Nia," she commanded. "We are going to fix this mess you created." I pulled out the chair and sat, keeping my posture relaxed. "I did not create a mess, Mother. I simply declined a bad investment." Valerie slapped her hand flat against the heavy wood table, rattling the silverware. "Do not use that corporate jargon with me in my own house," she snapped. "You humiliated your sister. You disrespected Preston. He came to you in good faith, offering you a chance to be part of a major real estate venture, and you threw it in his face out of pure spite." I looked directly at Preston. He gave me a sad, patronizing smile, shaking his head slowly, as if he pitied my ignorance. He was daring me to speak the truth, confident that my mother would never believe me over a wealthy white man. I turned my attention back to Valerie. "He did not offer me an opportunity, Mother. He came to my firm begging for a bailout because his company is drowning in toxic debt. He is broke. His credit is maxed out. If Vanguard Capital does not give him $50 million, he will be filing for bankruptcy before the wedding invitations even go out." Chloe slammed her water glass down. "Stop lying," she shrieked. "Preston comes from a long line of developers. His family owns half of Connecticut. You are just making things up because you cannot stand that I am marrying someone successful and you are going to die alone with your spreadsheets. You have always been jealous of me." I stared at Chloe, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with pity. "I am the CEO of a private equity firm, Chloe. My spreadsheets currently control more wealth than Preston's entire extended family has seen in 3 generations. I have no reason to be jealous of a woman marrying a fraud." Valerie cut in, her voice cold and absolute, completely disregarding my reality. "Enough. I do not want to hear another word about bank statements or liabilities. Preston is family now. In this house, family takes care of each other. You have money, Nia. Clearly you have more money than you ever let on. You are going to authorize that transfer on Monday morning. You are going to give Preston the funds he needs to finish his project, and you are going to apologize to him for your unacceptable behavior." I sat back in my chair, genuinely amazed by the sheer audacity of her demand. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, trying to find any trace of maternal instinct beneath her obsession with status. "You are ordering me to hand over $50 million of my company's capital to save a man who tipped me a $100 bill to leave his party." He was joking. Nia, Valerie dismissed immediately, waving her hand in the air as if swatting away a fly. "You are always so incredibly sensitive. You lack grace. Preston is from a different world. He is under a lot of pressure, and he made a harmless joke. But you are holding on to it like a petty, bitter child. You owe this family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. Now it is your turn to contribute and elevate us." Preston finally spoke, his voice dripping with calculated sincerity. "Valerie, please. Do not be too hard on her. Nia just does not understand how high-level commercial development works. It is very complex. I am willing to look past the disrespect if she is willing to do the right thing. I can even offer her a small advisory role on my board once the project is completed, just to make her feel included." The arrogance was entirely suffocating. He was sitting at my parents' dining table eating food my father paid for, trying to manipulate my mother into forcing me to save his skin, all while treating me like a slow, emotionally unstable child. He was using Valerie's toxic favoritism as a weapon against me, knowing exactly how to push her buttons to get what he wanted. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that commanded the room. And I am not giving you a single dime. My decision is final. Valerie stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face contorted with a vicious anger I had seen many times before, but never directed at me with this level of venom. If you walk out of this house without promising to wire that money, you are no longer a part of this family, she threatened. You will be dead to me, Nia. I will not have a selfish, backstabbing traitor in my home. You will not come to the wedding. You will not come to holidays. You will be completely cut off until you learn your place. I looked up at my mother standing there with her finger pointed at the door, her chest heaving with righteous indignation. She truly believed that threatening to excommunicate me would break me. She thought I was still the desperate little girl begging for a scrap of her affection, terrified of being pushed out into the cold. She expected me to crumble, to cry, and to reach for my checkbook to buy my way back into her good graces. Instead, the words selfish echoed in my ears, bouncing around the walls of that stuffy dining room. It was the trigger I had been waiting for, the final key, unlocking a heavy steel vault of resentment I had kept securely sealed for over a decade. I slowly stood up from the oak table. I did not raise my voice, and I did not slam my fists. But the sudden, absolute stillness in my posture made my father physically flinch and caused Preston to lean back defensively in his chair. Selfish, I repeated, letting the word roll slowly off my tongue so it hung heavy in the silent room. Let us talk about sacrifice, Mother. Let us talk about the true meaning of family loyalty. Let us rewind the clock to the summer I turned 18. Valerie's face instantly tightened. The self-righteous fury in her eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden sharp flash of panic. She looked away, her eyes darting toward the living room archway. My father suddenly found his plate of cold roasted chicken utterly fascinating, refusing to lift his head. I had just been accepted into Columbia University. I continued, my voice ringing clearly with a terrifying calm. I had worked nights and weekends throughout my entire high school career. I maintained a perfect grade point average while you were busy driving Chloe to expensive pageant rehearsals and exclusive designer boutiques in the city. I did my part. I played by the rules. And you and Dad had set up a joint college savings account for both of us when we were little. I remember sitting right there at that kitchen island, holding my acceptance letter in my hands, practically shaking with excitement. I asked you for the bank details so I could pay my first semester tuition deposit. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the table. I landed on the golden couple, Chloe and Preston. Tell Preston where my tuition money went, Mother, I demanded. Tell this wealthy, highly successful real estate developer how you handle family finances. Tell him how you funded his beautiful bride's extravagant lifestyle. I am sure a man of his business acumen would love to know the truth about his future in-laws. Valerie lifted her chin, her pride refusing to let her back down even when backed into a corner. That was different. And you know it, Nia. Chloe was going through a very difficult emotional transition that year. She was feeling lost. She needed a change of scenery to find her passion. You were always so resilient, so tough. I knew you could figure it out on your own. A change of scenery, I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that made Chloe shift uncomfortably. You drained $80,000 from my college fund. You walked into that bank and wiped out every single penny of my financial security so Chloe could take a 6-week luxury shopping trip to Paris and Milan to find herself. And then you used whatever was left in the account to pay for her elite private arts academy because she decided she wanted to be a fashion influencer for the semester. You stole the foundation of my future to buy her a vacation. Chloe scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. Her pink Chanel suit rustled in the quiet room. It was an educational trip, Nia, she whined, rolling her eyes. It was about cultural immersion and networking. I needed that arts academy to build my personal brand. You were always just going to get a boring business degree anyway. You did not need $80,000 just to learn how to punch numbers into a calculator. You are making a huge deal out of nothing. I turned my piercing gaze directly to my sister. The sheer delusion on her face was almost scientific in its perfection. I needed that money to survive, Chloe. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. While you were posting photos of yourself sipping vintage champagne on a balcony overlooking Rome, I was sitting in the financial aid office of my university sobbing because my classes were about to be canceled for non-payment. I had to take out massive predatory student loans just to stay enrolled. I worked a full-time night shift at a logistics warehouse in Queens while taking 18 credits a semester. I rode the subway at 3 in the morning. I slept 3 hours a night for 4 consecutive years. I ate cheap noodles while you dined at Michelin star restaurants. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the dining table. I built my empire on my own bleeding back. I was buried under a mountain of debt that you two created, and I clawed my way out of it while you paraded around Europe on my dime. I looked back at my mother. The vein in her neck was throbbing. You sacrificed my education, my financial freedom, and my mental health so your golden child could have a luxury holiday. You stole from me, and you have the absolute nerve to stand in this dining room 14 years later and call me selfish because I refuse to hand over $50 million of my hard-earned capital to a man who is actively going bankrupt. Preston cleared his throat loudly, attempting to regain control of a narrative that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered a patronizing diplomatic smile. Now, Nia, let us all take a deep breath, Preston said smoothly, using his corporate negotiation voice. Family history is always complicated. Parents have to make tough choices, and we all make sacrifices for the people we love. But holding on to this ancient resentment is simply not productive for anyone. We are talking about the future of a major real estate firm right now. We are talking about protecting your family's reputation and ensuring Chloe has the future she deserves. Let us focus on moving forward. I snapped my eyes to him, shutting him down instantly. I am not talking to you, Preston. You are a guest at this table, and you are currently begging for my charity. Do not mistake my mother's desperation for your authority. You have zero power here, and you have absolutely no right to speak on my trauma. I looked at my mother one last time. Her face was flushed dark red, her jaw set in stubborn, arrogant defiance. She would never apologize. She would rather watch the world burn to the ground than admit she had failed her eldest daughter. She would protect her fabricated image of perfection until her dying breath. You threatened to cut me off, Mother, I said, my tone now eerily calm and entirely detached. You threatened that I would be dead to you if I did not sign over my company's money. What you completely fail to understand is that I cut you off the day I graduated with university honors, and you did not bother to show up because Chloe had a minor head cold. You are not disowning me. I am firing you. You are fired from my life. I picked up my leather purse from the back of the chair. I looked at my father, who was now openly weeping silently into his linen napkin, a broken man who had enabled this abuse for decades. I felt a brief fleeting pang of sadness for him, but he had made his choice long ago. I turned and walked toward the front hallway. Behind me, the dining room erupted. Chloe started to wail hysterically, crying to Preston about how cruel and vindictive I was being to her. I could hear my mother screaming my name, demanding that I come back into the room and show some respect to my elders. I did not turn around. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the cool, crisp Sunday afternoon air. I had survived their theft when I was 18, and I had built a fortress of wealth and power they could never breach. But as I slid into the quiet sanctuary of my waiting car, my mind immediately shifted to the next tactical move. Preston Caldwell was not a man who took rejection well, especially from a black woman he deemed entirely beneath him in the social hierarchy. He was backed into a financial corner, desperate to save his failing business and his pristine white-collar reputation. Desperate men are inherently dangerous. If he could not manipulate my mother into forcing my hand, I knew he would try to destroy me publicly to get the leverage he needed. I pulled my phone out of my purse and dialed my chief of public relations. The family dinner was over, but the corporate war was just about to begin. I dialed Julian, my director of public relations, before my driver had even merged onto the highway. I told him to put our entire crisis management team on immediate standby. I knew Preston Caldwell was a cornered animal, and men of his pedigree did not know how to fail quietly. They were taught from birth that the world belonged to them, and when reality contradicted that belief, they used their inherited power to bend the truth. I anticipated a retaliation, but the sheer scale and viciousness of his attack still managed to confirm just how entirely devoid of morals he was. The strike happened on Wednesday morning. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing quarterly earnings, when Julian walked into my office without knocking. His face was grim, and he was carrying a sleek silver tablet. He placed it on my desk and slid it toward me. It was the digital front page of the Financial Observer, a legacy media outlet deeply embedded in the old money network of the East Coast. It was the kind of publication read by institutional investors, politicians, and the wealthy elite. The Caldwell family had deep ties to the editorial board dating back decades. The headline was printed in bold, aggressive letters: Vanguard Capital and the Exploitation of the Minority Working Class. I began to read the article, my face remaining perfectly still, while a cold anger crystallized in my chest. Preston had used his connections to plant a highly orchestrated, entirely fabricated hit piece. The article accused Vanguard Capital of engaging in predatory lending practices, specifically targeting minority-owned businesses. It claimed that I routinely bought out struggling companies in black and brown neighborhoods, fired the local workforces, and sold off the assets to massive corporate conglomerates. It painted me as a ruthless, self-hating corporate raider who built my fortune by stepping on the backs of my own community to gain the favor of Wall Street. There were anonymous quotes from supposed former employees claiming I created a toxic, abusive work environment. There were manipulated statistics designed to make my routine commercial acquisitions look like aggressive gentrification. The absolute hypocrisy of the piece was staggering. Preston Caldwell, a white developer who was actively driving his own minority subcontractors into bankruptcy by refusing to pay their invoices, was using his elite media connections to accuse a black woman of his own exact crimes. By noon, the article was everywhere. It was trending on social media platforms. Financial blogs were picking it up and running with the narrative. Julian stood by my desk, his phone buzzing constantly with requests for comments from various news networks. He advised me that we needed to issue a comprehensive denial immediately. He wanted to release our internal diversity reports, our community reinvestment statistics, and our philanthropic records to counter the narrative. He warned me that if we let the story breathe, our institutional investors might get spooked and start pulling their capital. I told Julian to do absolutely nothing. I ordered him to issue a strict no comment to every single press inquiry. He looked at me like I had lost my mind, arguing that silence would look like an admission of guilt. I explained to him that responding to a smear campaign only gives it legitimacy. If we panicked and started defending ourselves, we would be playing Preston's game on his turf. I wanted to see exactly how far Preston was willing to push this charade before I cut the ground out from under him. The emotional betrayal arrived an hour later. My assistant informed me that the article was gaining massive traction online because it was being actively promoted by someone claiming to be intimately connected to the situation. I opened my personal social media account and saw it. Chloe had shared the article on all of her public platforms. She had added her own tearful, victimized commentary, stating how devastated she was to learn the truth about her estranged sister's dark business practices. She wrote a long paragraph about how our family always stood for integrity and how heartbroken our mother was by my greed. My mother, Valerie, had immediately liked and reshared the post to her own network of high society social clubs. They were actively participating in the public destruction of my reputation. They were so blinded by their desperation to protect Preston and his imaginary wealth that they eagerly threw gasoline on the fire he had set around me. They believed that public humiliation would break my spirit that I would be so terrified of losing my corporate standing that I would finally bow to their demands. At precisely 3 o'clock, my private office line rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but I already knew who was on the other end. I pressed the speaker button and leaned back in my leather chair. "Hello, Preston," I said, my voice smooth and untroubled. There was a brief pause on the line. He clearly expected me to answer the phone in a state of sheer panic. When he spoke, his tone was dripping with false sympathy, playing the role of the concerned family member. "Nia," he said, letting out a heavy theatrical sigh. "I just saw the news. The Financial Observer piece is making massive waves in the industry. My board of directors has been talking about it all morning. It looks incredibly bad for you. I cannot believe the press is attacking you like this." I picked up a gold pen from my desk and turned it over in my fingers. It is amazing how fast news travels when you are the one who writes it and hands it directly to your friends on the editorial board. Preston. He let out a low, condescending chuckle. "Now, Nia, let us not throw wild accusations around. I am just calling because I genuinely care about Chloe's family. The media can be absolutely brutal, especially to a woman in your position. Once a narrative like this takes hold, it can destroy a firm like Vanguard in a matter of days. Investors do not like controversy. They will pull their funds and your entire empire will collapse. It is a shame, really." He let the threat hang in the air, waiting for me to crack. When I remained completely silent, he finally laid his cards on the table. He leaned into the extortion. But Preston continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have a lot of influence with the publisher of The Observer. Our families go way back. I could make a few calls. I could have the article pulled from the digital archives, issue a retraction, and kill the story before it reaches the evening television broadcasts. I can make this entire nightmare go away for you, Nia. I can protect you." I stopped turning the gold pen. "And what is the price for this protection?" "Preston." "Just a simple signature," he replied smoothly, the greed practically vibrating through the phone line. "Sign the $50 million funding agreement for my development project. Authorize the wire transfer by the end of the business day. Once the funds hit my company's account, I will make the calls, and Vanguard Capital's reputation will be spotless again. We can put all this family drama behind us and move forward as profitable partners." It was the ultimate manifestation of his arrogance. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He thought he could use his white privilege, his media connections, and my own family's betrayal to extort $50 million from a company he viewed as inferior. He saw me as a target he could easily manipulate with a manufactured public relations crisis. "Preston," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of an executioner, "I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I certainly do not negotiate with desperate men who are 2 weeks away from defaulting on their balloon payments. You launched a smear campaign because you are weak. You are trying to extort me because you are completely out of options." I could hear his breathing hitch over the phone. His confident facade was cracking. "Nia, you are making a massive mistake. If you do not fund my project, I will make sure every major publication in the country runs a feature on your corrupt practices. I will destroy you." "You can certainly try," I replied calmly. "But you should know something about me, Preston. I did not inherit my power, and I do not rely on country club connections to maintain it. I built my empire in the dark while people like you underestimated me. So go ahead, call your friends at The Observer, tell them to print whatever they want. Because when I finally strike back, I am not going to use a newspaper article. I am going to use the law, and I am going to take absolutely everything you have." I reached out and ended the call, cutting off his frantic response. I sat in the quiet of my office for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. Preston had shown his hand. He had chosen public warfare. Now it was time for me to find the weapon that would permanently end him. I picked up my phone and dialed the head of my corporate intelligence division. I needed them to dig deeper than standard financial records. I needed the smoking gun. My corporate intelligence team operated with ruthless efficiency. I had built Vanguard Capital not just on financial acumen, but on information superiority. By 5 o'clock that evening, My lead investigator, Marcus, sat across from me in my office, a thick, unredacted file resting on the glass desk between us. The documents he presented were far more damning than a simple story of a failing real estate firm. They revealed a calculated predatory agenda that made Preston's extortion attempt look like a minor distraction. Marcus opened the file, sliding a series of zoning applications, architectural blueprints, and LLC registration documents toward me. Preston Caldwell was not just building another luxury high-rise. Marcus explained, his voice low and serious. He was executing a massive gentrification initiative masked as urban renewal. I picked up the blueprints. My blood turned to ice as my eyes traced the familiar street names and property lines. The $50 million he was begging for was the final tranche of funding needed to execute a project called the Heritage Heights redevelopment. But it was not redevelopment. It was eradication. Preston's firm had systematically bought up the commercial debt of the small businesses lining the main avenue of my family's historic Black neighborhood in Brooklyn. His plan was to foreclose on those debts, simultaneously bulldoze the existing structures, and replace them with high-end, unaffordable luxury condominiums designed exclusively for an influx of wealthy, predominantly white residents. He was going to pave over the community that had raised me. He was going to demolish the very grocery stores, barbershops, and community centers that formed the backbone of the neighborhood. He was going to displace thousands of families who had lived there for generations, all to build a sterile monument to his own greed. The sheer audacity of his plan was staggering. But the second revelation in Marcus's file was what truly solidified Preston's status as a sociopath. "Look at the federal grant applications," Marcus instructed, pointing to a stack of papers stamped with government seals. "Preston's firm has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years. He cannot secure traditional financing because every major bank knows his debt-to-equity ratio is toxic, so he found a loophole. He applied for massive federal subsidies under the Minority Business Enterprise Program." I stared at the paperwork, my mind quickly connecting the dots. The MBE program was designed to provide crucial capital and government contracts to businesses owned and operated by marginalized communities. It was a lifeline for minority entrepreneurs fighting against systemic economic barriers. Preston Caldwell, a wealthy white man from a legacy family, did not qualify for a single cent of those funds. Unless I murmured, reading the name listed as the majority stakeholder on the newly formed shell company overseeing the Heritage Heights project. Unless he transfers 51% ownership to a Black woman, exactly, Marcus confirmed. "Chloe Jackson. He is using your sister. The wedding is not a romantic union, Nia. It is a corporate merger designed to commit federal grant fraud. He is marrying her solely to use her racial identity as a shield to access minority funding. He is going to use that government money to bulldoze her own community. And she has absolutely no idea she is the primary liability if the federal government ever investigates the fraud." A sickening wave of disgust washed over me. Preston was not just using Chloe for her aesthetics or to placate his ego. He was actively weaponizing her identity against her own people. And my mother, blinded by her desperate desire for social climbing, was gleefully handing her daughter over to a predator who viewed them both as nothing more than convenient tools for a real estate scam. This was the smoking gun. This was the weapon that would not just stop Preston's smear campaign, but obliterate his entire existence in the corporate world. I dismissed Marcus, thanking him for the flawless execution of his investigation. I sat alone in my office as the city lights flickered on outside my window. The emotional weight of the betrayal was heavy. My family had sold their souls for a man who was secretly planning to destroy their home and exploit their heritage for profit. But there was no time for sorrow. Sorrow was a luxury I could not afford in the middle of a war. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. I instructed her to begin drafting a very specific type of contract, one layered in complex financial terminology and aggressive debt restructuring clauses. I was going to give Preston exactly what he wanted. I was going to offer him a lifeline, but it would be a lifeline braided from razor wire. The next morning, the financial world was still buzzing with the fallout from the Observer article. News anchors debated my character, and online commentators tore apart my reputation. I ignored it all. I let Preston enjoy his manufactured victory. I let him believe his extortion tactic was working. I waited until the end of the business day, when I knew his anxiety would be peaking as his balloon payment deadline drew closer, and then I sent him a single brief email. The subject line read, "Settlement and Restructuring." The body of the email contained only one sentence: "Meet me at the Oak Room of the Vanguard Club tomorrow at noon to finalize the funding agreement." I knew he would not be able to resist. The Vanguard Club was a private, highly exclusive establishment frequented by the city's old money elite. It was an environment where Preston felt inherently superior, a place where he believed his pedigree gave him absolute authority over someone like me. He would see the location as a sign of my ultimate submission. He would walk in believing he had broken the arrogant black woman and forced her to hand over the keys to her kingdom. He had no idea he was walking into a meticulously laid trap, and that the pen he would use to sign the agreement would be the instrument of his own total destruction. The morning of the meeting arrived with a quiet, deceiving stillness. I was sitting at the kitchen island of my penthouse, sipping black coffee and reviewing the final clauses of the hostile takeover contract my legal team had drafted. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do was walk into the Vanguard Club at noon and hand Preston the pen. But at exactly 8:15, my secure private phone chimed with a high-priority alert. It was a direct notification from my senior asset manager at First Fidelity, the private banking institution that handled Vanguard Capital's real estate trusts and escrow accounts. The message was marked urgent and required my immediate biometric verification. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted portal. What I saw on the digital display made my blood run completely cold, not with fear but with a profound, terrifying realization of just how far my family was willing to go to destroy themselves. It was a scanned application for a high-interest, short-term commercial bridge loan. The amount requested was $2 million. The applicant's signatures at the bottom of the paperwork belonged to my mother, Valerie Jackson, and my sister, Chloe. I scrolled back to the top of the document to look at the collateral being offered to secure this massive sum of cash. There, printed in stark black ink, was the address of my childhood home, the historic Brooklyn property that had been in our family for 3 generations. They were mortgaging the family house to a predatory shadow lender, tightly affiliated with Preston Caldwell's development firm. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my penthouse suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. I pieced the timeline together with clinical precision. Preston was desperate. The $50 million he was trying to extort from me was for the long-term gentrification project, but he had immediate short-term debts crashing down on him today. He needed liquid cash just to keep his shell companies afloat until he could secure the larger Vanguard funding. He had clearly gone to my mother and sister, played the victim, and convinced them that he just needed a temporary cash injection to bridge the gap. Valerie and Chloe, completely blinded by the illusion of his wealth and utterly desperate to save the upcoming high society wedding, had agreed to fund him. They had crept behind my father's back, knowing Marcus would never agree to risk his home, and they had offered up the only tangible asset they thought they possessed. But there was a massive, fatal flaw in their desperate plan. Valerie did not own that house. 5 years ago, my parents had fallen severely behind on their mortgage payments because my mother was funneling their income into maintaining a fake wealthy lifestyle to impress her social club friends. They were weeks away from total foreclosure and public eviction. I found out through a mutual contact at their bank. I knew my mother's pride would never allow her to accept money directly from the daughter she despised, so I handled it silently. I used a Vanguard holding trust to pay off the entire balance of the mortgage. I bought the debt, acquired the deed, and legally transferred the ownership of the property into my own name. I let my parents continue to live there rent-free. I never asked for a dime, and I never breathed a word of it to anyone. The bank simply sent Valerie a letter stating that her account was closed and the debt was settled. In her profound financial ignorance, my mother simply assumed her prayers had been answered, or that the bank had made a glorious administrative error. She never questioned it, and she certainly never hired a lawyer to check the county records. Now, looking at the scanned loan application, I could see exactly what they had done. Valerie had dug through her old filing cabinets and pulled out an outdated, legally voided copy of the original deed from 20 years ago. She had presented it to Preston's shady lenders as proof of ownership. And Preston, moving too fast and acting out of sheer desperation, had pushed the paperwork through without waiting for a proper title search. The irony was thick enough to choke on. My mother and sister were secretly mortgaging their sanctuary to hand $2 million to the exact same man who was actively planning to bulldoze that very neighborhood. They were funding their own eradication. I stared at the glowing screen of my tablet. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. For years I had endured their insults, their neglect, and their blatant favoritism. I had watched my mother drain my college fund, and I had listened to her tell me I was an embarrassment. But this was a new level of depravity. This was the ultimate betrayal. Valerie was willing to render herself and my father completely homeless just to protect the ego of a white man who viewed her as nothing more than a useful idiot. She was willing to risk everything they had built just to keep her golden child wrapped in designer clothes. My asset manager had flagged the transaction because the property address triggered an automatic block in the First Fidelity system, recognizing the asset belonged to my private trust. My phone began to vibrate on the marble counter. It was my manager calling to ask for authorization to reject the fraudulent loan and notify the authorities of the attempted title fraud. I hovered my hand over the phone. With one single word, I could stop the transaction. I could freeze the loan, protect my father from being blindsided, and save my mother and sister from committing a massive financial felony. I could be the bigger person. I could step in and rescue them from their own staggering stupidity one more time. I pulled my hand back and let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. I was done being their savior. I was done quietly cleaning up the messes they made while they spat in my face. If I stopped the loan now, Valerie would just find another way to ruin them, and Preston would slip away to find another victim. They needed to learn the true cost of their absolute loyalty to a predator. I opened the encrypted messaging app and typed a direct order to my asset manager. Do not flag the transaction. Lift the internal block. Allow the bridge loan to process, and let the funds transfer to Caldwell Development Partners. Send me the unredacted confirmation receipts the second the wire clears. I pressed send. It was done. By allowing the transaction to go through, I was letting them lock the doors to their own prison. By signing that voided deed over for cash, Valerie and Chloe had just committed federal bank fraud and wire fraud. By accepting invalid collateral to secure a commercial loan across state banking lines, Preston Caldwell had just committed a massive felony of his own. I now held the absolute power to send all three of them to federal prison whenever I chose. I stood up from the kitchen island and walked into my expansive dressing room. I bypassed the conservative charcoal suits I usually wore to board meetings. Today was not a day for blending in. Today was a day for absolute domination. I selected a sharply tailored crimson-red blazer and matching trousers. It was the color of a warning. It was the color of a predator stepping out of the shadows. I carefully applied my makeup, my hands completely steady. I felt no guilt. I felt no lingering attachment to the toxic dynamic that had chained me down for 32 years. I slipped on a pair of designer heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. I picked up my leather briefcase, which now contained the hostile takeover contract, the evidence of the gentrification plot, the minority grant fraud, and the freshly minted proof of their illegal bridge loan. I walked out of my penthouse and stepped into the private elevator. I was going to the Vanguard Club. I was going to sit across from Preston Caldwell in his sanctuary of old money privilege. I was going to let him smile, let him gloat, and let him think he had conquered me. And then, I was going to lay every single piece of paper on the table and watch his entire world burn to the ground. I stepped out of my private elevator and glided through the underground parking garage to where my driver was waiting beside the sleek black Maybach. The heavy door shut with a solid, isolating thud, sealing me inside the soundproof cabin. As the car smoothly navigated up the ramp and merged into the chaotic midtown traffic, I pulled my phone from my briefcase. The trap was set, the contracts were drafted, and the evidence of their massive financial crimes was safely secured in my leather portfolio. But a trap is only effective if the prey walks into it willingly. I needed Preston Caldwell's guard to be entirely non-existent. I needed him bloated with arrogance. I needed him to believe he had already won. I dialed his personal cell phone number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hello, Nia," Preston answered. His voice was thick with smug satisfaction. He did not sound like a man who was secretly drowning in debt or committing federal fraud. He sounded like a king receiving a call from a defeated peasant. I took a slow breath and fundamentally altered my demeanor. When I spoke, I stripped all the authority and steel from my voice. I made my tone softer, slightly raspy, as if I had been crying or losing sleep. "Preston," I said, allowing a perfectly calculated tremble to seep into my words. "I just wanted to confirm our meeting at noon." "Of course," he replied smoothly. "I am already at the club having a scotch. I must admit, I was pleasantly surprised by your email yesterday. It is good to see you are finally coming to your senses." I forced a heavy, defeated sigh. "You left me with no other choice, Preston. The article in The Observer, it is completely out of control. My board of directors called an emergency meeting this morning. Our institutional investors are getting spooked by the allegations. They hate bad press, and this narrative about me exploiting minority neighborhoods is toxic. If I do not make this go away, they are going to start pulling their capital by the end of the week." I could practically hear his chest puffing out through the phone line. He was eating up every single word. "I told you, Nia," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "The media can be a vicious machine if you do not know how to play the game. You are a smart girl, but you are out of your depth in these circles. I can make a few calls and have that article scrubbed from the internet before we even finish our appetizers. You just need to sign the funding agreement." "I will sign it," I whispered, injecting a note of desperate surrender into my voice. "I will authorize the $50 million transfer. I just want this nightmare to be over. My mother called me last night. She told me I was dead to her. She told me I was ruining Chloe's life. I have spent my entire life trying to earn her approval, and now I have lost my family entirely. I cannot fight all of you anymore. I am exhausted, Preston. You win." There was a moment of silence on the line. It was the sound of a predator basking in the ultimate victory. He had used his white privilege, his media connections, and my own toxic family dynamics to break a black female CEO. In his mind, the natural order of the world had been restored. "Do not cry, Nia," he said, adopting the sickeningly benevolent tone of a merciful conqueror. "Family fights happen. Your mother is just emotional about the wedding. Once you fund my project and the press backs off, everything will go back to normal. Valerie will forgive you once she sees you are finally acting like a team player. You are making the right decision." "Thank you," I murmured meekly. "I am on my way to the Vanguard Club now." "Excellent," he said. "Just a heads up, the Vanguard Club has a very strict dress code. No denim, no sneakers. My grandfather was a founding member, so they know me very well, but they can be quite particular about guests. Just tell the concierge you are meeting me in the Oak Room. I will make sure they let you in." "I will be there soon," I replied and ended the call. I lowered the phone to my lap. The fragile, broken persona vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating grin. He had swallowed the bait whole. He truly believed he was doing me a favor by allowing me to surrender in his prestigious old money fortress. He thought the heavy mahogany walls and the legacy of his grandfather would intimidate me into absolute submission. He had no idea that I was wearing a crimson-red suit that cost more than his remaining liquid assets. He had no idea that I already held the receipts for his fraudulent $2 million bridge loan. And he certainly had no idea that the Vanguard Club, the very institution he was using to assert his dominance, was currently negotiating a private buyout with my firm because they were failing to pay their property taxes. The Maybach glided to a smooth halt in front of the club's imposing stone facade. The building was an architectural relic of the Gilded Age, designed with massive columns and heavy iron doors to explicitly keep out anyone who did not fit the rigid criteria of wealth, whiteness, and male authority. For decades, people who looked like me were only allowed through the service entrance. Today, I was walking through the front door to execute one of their own. My driver opened the door. I stepped onto the pristine sidewalk, the crisp afternoon air hitting my face. I adjusted my blazer, the bold red fabric standing out sharply against the drab gray stone of the building. I walked up the wide marble steps with the measured predatory grace of a panther tracking its prey. A uniformed doorman stepped forward, his eyes quickly scanning my face and my bold attire. He opened his mouth, likely prepared to redirect me to a different entrance or ask for my membership card with a heavy dose of polite suspicion. I did not give him the chance to speak. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of warmth. "Preston Caldwell is expecting me in the oak room," I said, my voice sharp and commanding. The doorman blinked, slightly taken aback by the sheer force of my presence. "Right away, madame," he stammered, pulling the heavy iron door open wide. I stepped into the grand foyer. The air smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and stale cigar smoke. Oil portraits of severe-looking white men stared down from the dark wood-paneled walls. The silence in the room was thick, the kind of quiet that demands reverence. I felt no reverence. I felt only the thrilling anticipation of a demolition. I walked across the antique Persian rugs, the sharp click of my designer heels echoing loudly, deliberately disrupting the sacred quiet of the club. Several older members peered at me over their newspapers, their faces registering mild shock at the sight of an unapologetic black woman striding confidently through their sanctuary. I ignored them completely. My eyes were fixed on the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway. The brass plaque above them read Oak Room. I reached the doors, then paused for a fraction of a second. I placed my hand on the polished brass handle. Preston Caldwell was waiting on the other side, sipping his scotch, entirely convinced he was about to become $50 million richer. He thought I was coming to beg for mercy. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside, ready to deliver a nightmare he would never wake up from. The oak room was a cavern of dark mahogany vaulted ceilings and the suffocating scent of generations of unearned privilege. The heavy doors shut silently behind me, cutting off the low murmur of the main lobby. The room was sparsely populated, allowing for the kind of private high-stakes conversations that shaped the financial districts of the world. I spotted him immediately. Preston Caldwell was seated in a massive wingback leather chair near a grand stone fireplace that crackled with burning logs. He looked entirely in his element. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, his long legs casually crossed at the ankle. When he saw me approach, he did not stand up. He did not offer his hand for a professional greeting. He simply sat there swirling the scotch in his glass, a smug, victorious smile playing on his lips. He looked at my crimson-red suit, his pale eyes narrowing slightly in mild distaste before his expression smoothed back into arrogant amusement. "Have a seat, Nia," he commanded, gesturing vaguely to the empty chair across the small polished table. "You certainly chose a loud outfit for a surrender. But I suppose subtlety is an acquired trait." I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, keeping my posture intentionally rigid, playing the part of a woman who was out of her depth and entirely uncomfortable in his world. I placed my leather briefcase on the floor beside me. "I did not come here to discuss my wardrobe, Preston," I said, keeping my voice low and devoid of its usual authority. "I came here to finalize the funding agreement so you can call off your friends at the Observer. My board is panicking. I need this handled today." Preston took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. He relished the sight of my fabricated desperation. He placed the heavy crystal glass down on the table with a soft thud. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me with an expression of profound, sickening pity. "I knew you would eventually come around," he said softly, using the tone of a patient teacher speaking to a slow child. "You see, Nia, you have done reasonably well for yourself. Vanguard Capital is an impressive little boutique firm. You managed to hustle your way into some money, and I respect the grind. I really do. But you have fundamentally misunderstood how power actually works in this city. He leaned back, spreading his arms slightly, as if to encompass the entire exclusive club around us. Wealth is just math, Nia. Anyone can get lucky on a few commercial acquisitions. But class heritage, true institutional power, that is something you are born into. It is in the blood. It is in the legacy. No matter how many millions of dollars you manage to scrape together, no matter how many glass offices you build, you will always be an outsider looking in. Without people like me to validate your presence, without the Caldwell name to legitimize your firm, you are just a black girl from Brooklyn who got a lucky break. You do not belong in these rooms, and yesterday proved that. The moment I made a single phone call, your entire reputation began to crumble. You have no armor here. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his racism and classism hung in the air, thick and toxic. He was sitting across from a woman who held his total financial ruin in a leather briefcase, yet he was absolutely certain he was the superior being in the room. He thought he was doing me a favor by explaining the natural order of the universe to me. I looked down at my hands, forcing my shoulders to slump slightly, letting him believe his words were cutting deep into my insecurities. "I am just trying to protect my company," I murmured. "And that is exactly why I am going to help you," Preston said, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "I am going to throw you a lifeline, Nia. But obviously the terms of our arrangement need to reflect the new reality of the situation. You came to me needing a public relations rescue, and my time and influence are highly valuable." He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek, embossed leather folder. He placed it on the table and slid it across the polished wood toward me. "These are the updated terms for the Heritage Heights funding," he explained smoothly. "Vanguard Capital will wire the full $50 million to my development firm by the close of business today. However, it will no longer be structured as a standard commercial loan. It will be an equity partnership." I opened the folder, looking down at the freshly printed documents. I kept my face entirely blank as I read the clauses he had inserted. It was not a partnership. It was a corporate hijacking. "You want a 50% equity stake in Vanguard Capital's future acquisitions?" I said, making my voice tremble slightly, as if I were reading a death sentence. "And you want a permanent voting seat on my executive board?" Preston nodded, looking entirely pleased with himself. "It is for your own good, Nia. You need a steady, experienced hand to guide your firm. You need someone who knows how to navigate the elite circles of this city without triggering the kind of public relations disaster you are currently facing. I will take on the burden of managing your public image and your major acquisitions. I will be the public face of Vanguard when dealing with legacy institutions. I will integrate your firm into the old money network. In exchange, you provide the capital for my projects. It is a mutually beneficial synergy." He was demanding half of my future profits and the power to veto my corporate decisions, all without contributing a single cent of his own money. He wanted to hollow out my company, use my capital to fund his racist gentrification project, and then parade me around as his silent, obedient minority partner to secure government grants. He wanted to swallow my authority whole and leave me as a figurehead in my own empire. "And if I refuse to sign this?" I asked, quietly. Preston sighed, looking at me with cold, dead eyes. "Then I leave this club. I make a phone call, and tomorrow morning the Financial Observer runs a 3-part investigative series on your firm. I will have my friends on Wall Street quietly advise their clients to divest from Vanguard. I will ensure that you are blacklisted from every major commercial real estate deal on the East Coast. You will lose your investors, you will lose your company, and you will go back to whatever miserable little cubicle you started in. You do not have a choice, Nia. Sign the papers." I stared at the predatory contract sitting on the table between us. I thought about my mother, who had mortgaged her home to this monster. I thought about my sister, who was blindly marrying a man planning to commit federal fraud in her name. and I thought about the $100 bill he had handed me in the lobby of the Plaza Hotel, telling me to take a cab back to the hood. He had laid all his cards on the table. He had shown me the absolute darkest depths of his arrogance. He had dug his grave so deep that he would never be able to climb out. I closed his leather folder and pushed it back across the table. "You make a very compelling argument, Preston," I said, my voice suddenly shifting. The manufactured tremble vanished entirely. The soft, defeated posture evaporated. I sat up perfectly straight, planting my feet firmly on the floor. I looked him dead in the eye, dropping the mask of the terrified victim, and letting the ruthless, calculating CEO of Vanguard Capital step fully into the light. "But there is a slight problem with your proposal," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute razor-sharp authority. "I do not sign contracts drafted by men who are actively committing wire fraud." Preston froze. The smug smile vanished from his face as if it had been wiped away by a physical blow. His hand stopped swirling the scotch. He stared at me, his pale eyes widening slightly in sudden, uncomprehending shock. I reached down and unlatched my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of documents, the paper crisp and heavy. I did not slide them gently across the table. I dropped them directly in front of him with a loud, authoritative smack that echoed through the quiet oak room. "I brought my own paperwork, Preston, and unlike your little fairy tale, my terms are not up for negotiation." Preston stared at the thick stack of papers I had just slammed onto the mahogany table. For a fleeting second, genuine confusion masked his arrogant features. Then his default setting of condescension returned. He let out a harsh, dismissive laugh and leaned back in his wingback chair, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. "Do you really think you are in a position to make demands?" "Nia," he asked, his voice dripping with venom. "I just told you what is going to happen. You do not get to bring counteroffers to your own execution. My terms are final. If you do not sign my folder right now, I am making the phone call." I kept my eyes locked on his, entirely unfazed by his empty threats. "I am not making a counteroffer, Preston. I am giving you the reality of institutional finance. My board of directors will never authorize a $50 million wire transfer based on a hastily printed equity partnership you typed up in your country club. Vanguard Capital is a heavily regulated entity. We have compliance protocols. If you want the money today to cover your balloon payments, it has to be executed on our official corporate paper." I tapped the thick stack of documents with my manicured index finger. "This is a standardized corporate funding agreement drafted by my legal department this morning. It authorizes the immediate release of the $50 million you so desperately need. It satisfies my board. It bypasses the current public relations crisis by burying the transaction in subsidiary shell companies, and it gets you your cash by 4 o'clock this afternoon." Preston narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slowly. He looked at the intimidating stack of legal documents, his suspicion battling against his overwhelming greed. He reached out and pulled the stack toward him. What kind of subsidiary shell companies, he demanded, trying to sound like a man who was still entirely in control of the negotiation. "Standard international holding trusts," I replied smoothly, weaving the lie flawlessly. "To shield Vanguard from the negative press you so graciously generated for us, the funds will be routed through a third-party entity. The contract simply outlines the transfer mechanics. It is dense, I admit, but my lawyers are thorough. You can take it to your own legal team to review, of course. But you and I both know that corporate lawyers take at least 3 business days to dissect a document of this magnitude." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat. "And according to my intelligence, your commercial bridge loans default at exactly midnight tonight. If you walk out of this club without signing, you will be officially bankrupt before the sun comes up." The color drained from his face again. I had hit the exact nerve. He knew he did not have 3 days. He barely had 3 hours. He flipped open the heavy cover of the contract. His eyes darted across the pages, scanning the dense, labyrinthine legal jargon my attorneys had meticulously crafted. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. To the untrained eye or the desperate eye, it looked like a complex but standard disbursement agreement. I watched him turn to page 4. I knew exactly what was on that page. It was the only part he truly cared about. There it is, I said, pointing casually at the third paragraph. Schedule A. The authorization for the immediate wire transfer of $50 million to Caldwell Development Partners. Preston stared at the bold number printed on the page. I could see the greed illuminating his pale eyes. I could see the heavy weight of his impending financial doom lifting off his shoulders. He was so blinded by his own privilege, so convinced of my inherent inferiority, that he could not fathom a reality where I could outsmart him on paper. He genuinely believed I was handing over my empire just to save my social standing. He flipped to the signature page at the very back of the thick document. He looked up at me, a victorious, cruel smile stretching across his face. "You know, Nia," he said, reaching into his inner jacket pocket and pulling out a heavy gold fountain pen. "For a moment there, you almost had me convinced you were going to put up a real fight. But blood always tells, does it not? You people always fold when the real pressure is applied. You know who the masters of the universe are." I did not react to the vile insult. I simply reached into my briefcase, pulled out my own pen, and leaned over the table. I signed my name on the designated line for the CEO of Vanguard Capital. My hand did not shake. My strokes were bold and absolute. I flipped the heavy document around so it faced him, placing my hands flat on the polished table. "Your turn, Preston. Sign the document. Secure your future." Preston uncapped his gold pen. He did not read the preceding 40 pages. He did not ask for clarification on the jurisdiction clauses. He simply pressed the gold nib to the thick paper and slashed his arrogant signature across the bottom line. He capped his pen and let out a long, satisfied breath, sliding the document back to me. He picked up his crystal tumbler of scotch and raised it in a mocking toast. "Welcome to the Caldwell family, Nia. Do not worry. I will make sure your mother knows you finally learned how to follow orders." I took the document, verified his signature, and carefully placed it back into my leather briefcase. The latch clicked shut, sounding like the final lock on a prison cell. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I looked down at the man sipping his expensive scotch, completely unaware that he had just slit his own throat. "You should have read the fine print, Preston," I said, my voice dropping the facade of compliance entirely. It rang with cold, terrifying authority, echoing in the quiet oak room. Preston stopped with the glass halfway to his mouth. He frowned, his brow furrowing in sudden confusion. "What are you talking about? I read the disbursement schedule." "Yes, you read the disbursement schedule," I agreed, smoothing the front of my crimson blazer. "But you clearly skipped the section titled Assumption of Sovereign Debt. You see, Preston, that was not a funding agreement. That was a debt guarantee." The glass in his hand trembled slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means Vanguard Capital is not wiring $50 million to your development firm," I explained, enunciating every single word so the reality could shatter his fragile ego. "It means my company has just legally assumed the role of primary guarantor for every single toxic commercial loan you possess. Through a highly complex series of international transfers, my attorneys have already purchased your outstanding debts from an anonymous Swiss bank." Preston slammed his glass down on the table, spilling amber liquid across the polished wood. "You cannot do that. That is illegal. It is entirely legal, and you just signed the authorization," I replied with a chilling smile. "By signing that contract, you agreed to consolidate all of your liabilities under Vanguard Capital. You did not secure a partner today, Preston. You secured a master. I now own every single mortgage, every single bridge loan, and every single lien against your properties. I am your sole creditor." He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face turning a mottled, furious red. "You gave me a contract that said $50 million. The contract stated Vanguard Capital would assume up to $50 million of your toxic debt," I corrected him smoothly. The legal jargon was incredibly precise. You were just too arrogant and too broke to hire a lawyer to translate it for you. You thought you could extort a black woman into handing over her hard-earned fortune because you believe we exist solely to serve your class. But your arrogance just cost you your entire company. Preston lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table, looking as though he wanted to physically attack me. I will sue you. I will drag you through the courts for fraud. I will destroy Vanguard Capital. You will do absolutely nothing, I countered, my voice cracking like a whip, forcing him to freeze. The contract includes an immediate call provision. Because you are already technically in default on your previous loans, Vanguard Capital now has the legal right to demand full payment of your consolidated debt immediately, which means, Preston Caldwell, I am calling in your debt. Right now. You owe me $50 million payable immediately. He stared at me, the horror finally sinking in. He knew he did not have the money. He knew his company was a hollow shell. He knew he was ruined. And since you cannot pay, I continued, delivering the final fatal blow. Vanguard Capital will immediately initiate hostile foreclosure proceedings on all of your commercial properties, including the Heritage Heights project. Your gentrification plan is officially dead. Your company belongs to me. And when I walk out of this club, my public relations team is going to release the evidence of your minority grant fraud to the federal authorities. I picked up my briefcase and turned my back on the broken man gasping for air in his grandfather's exclusive club. I walked toward the heavy double doors, leaving the ruins of his legacy scattered across the polished mahogany floor. Preston Caldwell did not collapse onto the floor of the oak room. After the heavy double doors swung shut behind me, the initial wave of paralyzing terror that washed over him was quickly replaced by a desperate, blinding delusion. Men raised in the suffocating bubble of old money privilege possess a unique psychological defense mechanism. When faced with the undeniable reality of their own failure, their brains simply refuse to process it. Preston could not accept that a black woman from Brooklyn had outsmarted him legally, cornered him, and stripped him of his empire in his own grandfather's club. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed his lead corporate attorney. Pacing the length of the mahogany room, he barked out the details of the contract he had just blindly signed. The lawyer on the other end of the line was silent for a long, terrifying moment before confirming Preston's worst fear. If Vanguard Capital had legally purchased his debt from the Swiss lenders, the call provision was absolute. They were completely exposed. But Preston, fueled by arrogance and a sociopathic instinct for survival, saw one final desperate loophole: the minority business enterprise grants. If he could expedite his marriage to Chloe and finalize the transfer of 51% of his shell company into her name, the federal government would release the massive subsidies. He could use the taxpayer money intended to help minority communities to tie Vanguard Capital up in endless litigation, delaying the foreclosures just long enough to save his skin. But he needed Chloe to sign the federal paperwork, and he needed the marriage certificate immediately. An hour later, Preston walked into the penthouse suite my mother had rented for Chloe's wedding preparations. He did not look like a man staring down the barrel of federal prison. He wore his signature charismatic smile, and in his hands he carried a chilled bottle of vintage Dom Perignon. Chloe and my mother were sitting on a plush velvet sofa, reviewing floral arrangements and luxury seating charts. When Preston walked in, he popped the cork on the champagne. The loud crack echoed through the suite, a sound of manufactured victory. He poured the bubbling liquid into 3 crystal flutes and handed them to my sister and my mother. "We did it," Preston announced, raising his glass high. "I just left the Vanguard Club." Nia put up a bit of a fuss, shed a few tears about the media pressure, but in the end she folded exactly like I told you she would. She signed the corporate funding agreement. The $50 million is officially secured. Chloe let out a piercing shriek of delight, practically dropping her champagne flute as she threw her arms around Preston's neck. My mother Valerie sat back against the velvet cushions, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across her face. She took a sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with a toxic mixture of triumph and vindication. I knew she would break, Valerie said, her voice dripping with condescension. Nia has always been stubborn, but she is terrified of public embarrassment. She knows she cannot survive in the corporate world without our family's support and your connections, Preston. She finally realized her place. I am sure it was a humbling experience for her to hand over that kind of power. It was very humbling. Preston lied smoothly, wrapping an arm around Chloe's waist. But she made the smart choice. Now, because the funds are going to be routed through a few international holding trusts, the actual wire transfer might take a few days to clear the banking regulations. But the contract is signed. We are untouchable. Preston looked down at Chloe, his eyes shining with calculated manipulation. In fact, he said softly, I was thinking about how much stress this week has put on all of us. The media, the family drama. We should not have to wait another month to start our lives together. We have the money secured. I want to marry you right now, Chloe. Let us move the wedding up. Chloe gasped, her eyes going wide. Move it up to when? This Saturday, Preston replied without missing a beat. My family has incredible pull at the Plaza Hotel. I know for a fact they have a cancellation in their grand ballroom this weekend. Let us expedite the plans. We can upgrade the catering, double the floral budget, and make it the event of the season. A true celebration of our victory. Valerie practically vibrated with excitement. The sheer extravagance of moving a high society wedding up to the upcoming weekend appealed to every single one of her superficial desires. She immediately reached for her phone, already dialing her event planner, completely oblivious to the fact that she was rushing her favorite daughter straight into a federal trap. They spent the rest of the afternoon drinking expensive champagne, laughing at my supposed defeat, and maxing out Preston's remaining credit cards to expedite the lavish wedding upgrades. Chloe posted a smug, cryptic message on her social media accounts about how true power always wins and how grateful she was to have a man who could effortlessly put jealous people in their place. They went to sleep that night wrapped in a warm, comfortable blanket of absolute delusion. Meanwhile, 5 miles away, the atmosphere inside the executive suite of Vanguard Capital was entirely different. The sun had set over Manhattan, casting long, dark shadows across the city. The lights in my corner office were turned off, save for the cool blue glow of the digital displays on my glass desk. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, looking out over the sprawling metropolis that I had conquered. I was not drinking champagne. I was drinking black coffee, my mind operating with the cold, frictionless precision of a supercomputer. My executive assistant David stood silently by the door. Across the desk sat my lead corporate attorney, and Marcus, the head of my intelligence division. The time for negotiations was over. The time for playing the victim was over. It was time to execute the final phase of the operation. Trigger the hostile takeover protocol, I ordered, my voice cutting through the quiet room. My lead attorney nodded, her fingers flying across her encrypted laptop keyboard. The debt assumption has been legally recorded with the state authorities, she confirmed. We are now the primary lien holder on every commercial asset owned by Caldwell Development Partners. We have drafted the default notices and the hostile foreclosure filings. Do not file them with the county clerk yet. I instructed, my eyes locked on the glowing skyline. If we file tonight, his automated legal alerts will notify him and he will try to run. We are going to let him believe his lie until the very last possible second. We wait until Saturday evening. We wait until the exact moment he stands up in front of his wealthy friends and his elite family to give his wedding toast. I turned to Marcus. Are the dossiers prepared for the federal authorities? Marcus slid 2 thick black folders across the glass desk. The first folder contains the undeniable proof of his minority business enterprise grant fraud. It details his plan to use Chloe as a shell owner to secure government funds. The second folder contains the evidence of the fraudulent $2 million bridge loan. It includes the voided deed your mother supplied and the forged collateral documents Preston signed. The moment you give the signal, these folders will be digitally transmitted directly to the white-collar crime division of the FBI. I rested my hands on the black folders. Inside those pages lay the absolute destruction of everything my mother valued, and everything Preston Caldwell thought he was entitled to. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, theft, and unearned superiority. They thought they could steal my future to fund their fantasies. They thought they could mortgage my house to pay for their mistakes. "David," I said, looking over at my assistant, "call the private aviation terminal. Ensure my jet is fueled and ready for a late-night departure on Saturday. And contact the Plaza Hotel. I need to make a slight adjustment to the guest list for the Caldwell wedding reception." I looked back out at the city. Preston Caldwell and my family were currently sleeping soundly, dreaming of their glorious victory. They had no idea that while they were popping champagne and celebrating their hollow triumph, the architect of their demise was sitting in the dark, quietly sealing all the exits. Saturday evening at the Plaza Hotel was a masterclass in performative wealth and staggering financial delusion. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a suffocatingly opulent wonderland, entirely funded by Preston Caldwell's maxed-out credit cards and the phantom $50 million he believed was sitting in an international holding trust. 10,000 white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, suspended by invisible wires so they appeared to float above the guests. A 12-piece string quartet played classical renditions of modern pop songs, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. The guest list was a precise, calculated collision of two completely different worlds, trying desperately to impress one another. On one side of the room stood Preston's family and their old money network, sipping their drinks with tight, practiced smiles, projecting an air of polite superiority. On the other side were my mother's high society friends from her various elite social clubs, dressed in their finest gowns, practically vibrating with the thrill of finally rubbing shoulders with the Caldwell dynasty. It was a room built entirely on aesthetics, a fragile house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. At the center of it all was Chloe. She wore a custom silk and lace gown that trailed 10 feet behind her, a diamond tiara resting securely in her blonde hair. She looked like royalty floating from table to table, completely oblivious to the fact that the man holding her hand was legally bankrupt and actively plotting to bulldoze her childhood neighborhood. Preston played his part flawlessly. He shook hands with local politicians and wealthy patriarchs, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who had successfully conquered his financial crisis. I knew he was likely checking his phone every 5 minutes, waiting for the banking notification that would confirm my supposed wire transfer had cleared the weekend delays. He thought the silence from his bank was just standard administrative lag. I arrived at the Plaza Hotel precisely at 8 o'clock, stepping out of my Maybach and slipping through the heavily guarded service corridors. Because I had instructed my assistant to quietly modify the master guest list with the hotel management, the security team had been given specific orders to allow me unimpeded access. I did not enter through the main doors. I made my way up the carpeted stairs to the dark, shadowed mezzanine balcony that overlooked the entire ballroom. I stood there in the quiet dark, looking down at the glittering spectacle below. I was wearing a floor-length jet black evening gown with sharp, structured shoulders. It was a dress designed for a funeral. I watched as the dinner service concluded and the string quartet transitioned into a soft, romantic melody. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a single bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. My mother, Valerie, stepped up to the microphone. She was wearing a shimmering emerald green gown, her hair perfectly styled, her diamond jewelry catching the harsh light. She looked radiant, bloated with the toxic pride she had spent her entire life chasing. She tapped her crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear, ringing sound echoed through the massive ballroom, commanding absolute silence from the wealthy crowd. "Thank you," Valerie began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight to celebrate the union of two incredible families. When I look out at this magnificent room, I am overwhelmed with gratitude. I am looking at a room full of legacy, of tradition, and of true excellence. She paused, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, playing the role of the overwhelmed, loving matriarch to absolute perfection. Preston's parents nodded approvingly from their front row table. Raising a daughter like Chloe has been the greatest privilege of my life, Valerie continued, her voice projecting clearly over the state-of-the-art sound system. She has always been a light in our family. She is graceful, she is kind, and she understands the importance of family duty. And tonight, she is marrying a man who truly matches her brilliance. Preston, my dear son-in-law, you are a gentleman in every sense of the word. You come from a remarkable family, a family that understands the heavy responsibility of building a lasting legacy. You have elevated our family simply by choosing to love my daughter. We are so incredibly honored to call you our own. The crowd offered a polite murmuring applause. Preston raised his glass to my mother, flashing his signature arrogant smile. But Valerie was not finished. She gripped the microphone stand tighter, her eyes scanning the room, and the warm emotional tone of her voice shifted, taking on a sharp, bitter edge. Of course, on a night of such overwhelming joy, there are bound to be shadows, Valerie said, her smile tightening into a thin line. It is a sad reality of life that not everyone is capable of understanding true success. Sometimes the people who should be standing right beside you are the ones who try to tear you down. Some people are so consumed by their own small, mediocre lives that they cannot handle the brightness of someone else's joy. They choose bitterness over family. They choose their cold, empty bank accounts over the warmth of a loving home. A low, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the sections of the ballroom where our extended family was seated. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. She was standing on a stage paid for by my stolen money, actively using my absence to play the victim and elevate her own social standing. But we do not let the negativity of small-minded people dim our light, Valerie declared, her voice rising in a triumphant crescendo. We leave them behind in the dark where they belong. We move forward, we elevate, and we protect the people who truly matter. Tonight is about family. Tonight is about the Caldwell legacy. And tonight is about a future that cannot be touched by anyone's jealousy. She raised her crystal flute high into the air. Please everyone raise a glass. To Chloe and Preston. To a beautiful, wealthy, and untouchable future. To Chloe and Preston, the crowd echoed in unison. Hundreds of crystal glasses clinked together in the glittering light of the chandeliers. Up on the dark balcony, I looked down at my mother taking a long sip of her champagne, her face glowing with absolute, unquestionable victory. She had officially disowned me in front of 500 of the wealthiest people in the city. She had cemented her loyalty to a white man who was actively destroying her life. She had played her final card. I turned away from the balcony railing and walked toward the grand sweeping staircase that led directly down to the main floor. The toast was over. The performance had concluded. It was time for reality to crush her untouchable future into dust. The heavy oak doors at the base of the grand staircase swung open with a resounding thud that echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings. I stepped into the warm glow of the ballroom. I did not slip in quietly. I walked with the measured, predatory cadence of a woman who owned every square inch of the ground she stood on. The jet-black fabric of my gown absorbed the light, a stark contrast to the sea of pastels and white orchids surrounding me. A few heads turned, then a few more. The low murmur of the crowd began to die down, replaced by a tense, rippling silence that spread from the back of the room all the way to the main stage. The string quartet, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, faltered and slowly stopped playing. The only sound left in the massive space was the sharp rhythmic click of my heels against the polished marble floor. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. The crowd naturally parted for me, stepping back as if repelled by a magnetic force. I saw the faces of Preston's old money relatives contort in confusion. I saw my aunts and uncles shrink back in their chairs, recognizing the storm brewing in my eyes. Up on the stage, the triumphant smile melted off my mother's face, replaced by a mask of absolute fury. She tightened her grip on her crystal champagne flute. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, grabbing Preston's arm. Preston just stared at me. his brow furrowed in annoyance, completely unaware that the Grim Reaper had just walked into his wedding reception. I reached the steps of the stage and ascended without breaking my stride. Valerie stepped forward, her eyes blazing with toxic rage. She lowered the microphone, leaning in to hiss at me under her breath so the crowd would not hear. "What do you think you are doing?" Valerie demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "I told you that you were not welcome here. Get out of this hotel before I have security drag you out. You are ruining Chloe's night." I did not stop walking. I stepped directly into her personal space, forcing her to take a step back. I did not look at her dress. I did not look at the champagne glass she held. I reached out and firmly grasped the cold metal of the microphone stand, pulling it away from her. "Security works for me tonight, Mother," I said, my voice projecting loud and clear across the silent ballroom. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. Valerie froze, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. She looked out at her high society friends, realizing she was entirely powerless to stop whatever was about to happen. I turned to face the crowd, adjusting the microphone to my height. I looked out over the sea of wealthy, privileged faces. Then I looked directly at Preston Caldwell, who was now standing up from his front row seat, his jaw clenched tightly. "Good evening, everyone." I began, my voice smooth, calm, and terrifyingly steady. "My name is Nia Jackson. For those of you who do not know me, I am the mediocre daughter Valerie just mentioned in her beautiful toast. I am the woman who chose her bank account over the warmth of a loving home. And I am here tonight because there seems to be a massive misunderstanding about exactly who is funding this untouchable future you are all celebrating." Chloe started to cry, a loud theatrical sob meant to draw sympathy. Preston placed a protective hand on her shoulder, glaring at me. "Nia, that is enough!" Preston shouted from the floor, trying to use his booming, authoritative voice to regain control of the room. "You are intoxicated. You are making a fool of yourself. Step down from the stage immediately." I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that made him hesitate. "I am completely sober, Preston. But I do think we need to talk about intoxication. Specifically, the intoxicating delusion of wealth. You see, ladies and gentlemen, weddings of this magnitude are incredibly expensive. They require massive amounts of capital. Capital that my new brother-in-law simply does not possess." The whispers broke out instantly. Preston's parents looked at each other in horror. Preston took a step toward the stage, his face turning pale. "Shut your mouth," he threatened, dropping the gentleman act entirely. "Just 2 days ago," I continued, speaking clearly over the rising tension in the room, "my mother and my sister walked into the offices of a predatory shadow lender. They were desperate. Preston was facing immediate bankruptcy, and he needed a massive short-term cash injection just to keep his shell companies afloat until his wedding day. So in a touching display of absolute family loyalty, Valerie and Chloe decided to bail him out. They applied for a $2 million commercial bridge loan." Valerie dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered loudly against the stage floor, sending expensive liquids splashing across the hem of her emerald gown. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating panic. She had no idea how I knew. She had kept it a total secret. "To secure that $2 million, I said. Pacing slowly across the stage, my mother offered up collateral. She handed over the deed to our historic family home in Brooklyn. She mortgaged the roof over my father's head to hand cash to a man she barely knows, all to preserve the aesthetic of this ridiculous party." My father, Marcus, stood up from his table in the back. His face was a mask of pure betrayal and shock. He looked at his wife, shaking his head in disbelief. Valerie could not meet his eyes. She was shrinking under the heavy, judgmental stares of her elite social club friends. "But there is a minor detail that my mother forgot to check before she signed those federal loan documents," I announced, dropping my voice slightly so the crowd had to lean in to hear the execution. "You cannot mortgage an asset you do not own." The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. 5 years ago, I explained, looking directly into Valerie's terrified eyes, my parents were drowning in debt. They were 3 weeks away from public foreclosure. To save them from the humiliation of being thrown out onto the street, I bought the house. I paid off the bank, I cleared the debt, and I legally transferred the deed into my own private holding trust. I let you live there rent-free, Mother. I never asked for a thank you. But the house belongs to me. It has belonged to me for half a decade. Chloe let out a horrified scream, burying her face in her hands. Preston stumbled back a step, bumping into his table, the reality of the situation slamming into him like a freight train. Which means I concluded, my voice ringing with finality, the deed you gave to Preston's lenders on Thursday was completely void. The collateral is worthless. By signing those papers, you and Chloe committed massive federal bank fraud. And Preston, by accepting a fraudulent deed across state lines to secure commercial funding, you just committed wire fraud. The $2 million you spent on these orchids, this caviar, and this beautiful ballroom was stolen. I looked out at the sea of wealthy elites. Their faces were pale. They were no longer looking at a high society family. They were looking at a circle of desperate criminals. The illusion was shattered permanently. But I was not finished. The deed was just the first strike. I had to finish the demolition. Before the collective gasp of the room could even settle, I turned my back on my mother and locked my gaze entirely on Preston. The color had completely vanished from his face. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, finally realizing the ground beneath his feet was made of sand. But I was not just going to push him off the edge. I was going to make sure everyone in his elite circle watched him fall. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers, signaling the audio-visual booth hidden at the back of the ballroom. I had visited them earlier in the evening with a very generous cash incentive and a flash drive. Instantly, the massive digital screens flanking the main stage shifted. The romantic montage of Chloe and Preston's engagement photos vanished. In their place, stark high-resolution architectural blueprints and municipal zoning applications illuminated the room. Let us talk about Preston's magnificent real estate venture, I announced, my voice echoing through the silent hall. The project he was so desperate to fund that he allowed my mother to commit federal fraud. Look at the screens, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Heritage Heights redevelopment plan. I walked across the stage, pointing to the glowing white lines of the blueprints. These documents outline a massive systemic gentrification initiative. Preston's company has been quietly buying up the commercial debt of the small businesses in my family's historic Black neighborhood in Brooklyn. His plan was never to revitalize the community. His plan was to foreclose on those debts, bulldoze the existing structures, and pave over the very grocery stores, barbershops, and community centers that raised my sister and me. He was going to displace thousands of families to build unaffordable luxury condominiums. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with a distinct tone of disgust. Even the old money elites in the room found the sheer predatory nature of the project distasteful to be aired so publicly. I looked down at Chloe. She was staring at the screens, her mouth hanging slightly open. But wait, I continued, my tone mocking his earlier arrogance. Preston is a white man from a legacy family. He does not qualify for the federal minority business enterprise grants required to subsidize a project in that specific district. So how did he plan to get his hands on millions of dollars of taxpayer money meant for marginalized entrepreneurs? I looked directly into my sister's tear-filled eyes. He needed a minority shield, Chloe. He needed a Black woman to list as the majority stakeholder of his new shell company. This wedding is not a romantic union. It is a corporate merger designed to commit federal grant fraud. He was using your identity to secure government funds to bulldoze your own community. And you were going to be the primary liability when the federal investigators inevitably discovered the scam. Chloe dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, mingling with my mother's spilled drink. She stepped away from Preston as if he had suddenly caught fire. She looked at him, begging him to deny it. But Preston was too busy staring at the blueprints on the screens, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "Turn it off!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking violently. He pointed at the audio-visual booth. "Turn those screens off right now. You cannot do this, Nia. You signed a contract with me. Vanguard Capital is my partner. You legally assumed my debt. We are in this together." I let out a low, cold laugh that cut right through his hysteria. "Did you really think I would ever partner with a man like you, Preston? Did you really believe I would use my empire to fund the destruction of my own heritage? I stepped back to the center of the stage, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I did not just assume your debt, Preston. When you signed that contract in the Vanguard Club, you agreed to an immediate call provision. Because you were already in default with your previous lenders, I demanded full payment of your $50 million debt the moment I walked out of the room. Preston shook his head wildly. You cannot call a debt I cannot pay. It takes months to file for foreclosure. Normally, yes, I replied smoothly. But you failed to read the secondary equity conversion clause buried on page 42. Because you failed to satisfy the immediate call provision, Vanguard Capital exercised its legal right to convert your toxic debt into company equity. The transition was finalized by my legal team just hours ago. I gripped the microphone, leaning forward to deliver the final fatal blow. Vanguard Capital just executed a complete hostile takeover of Caldwell Development Partners. I did not come here tonight to ruin your wedding. I came here to inform you that Vanguard Capital now officially owns 51% of your company. I am the majority shareholder. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. The wealthy patriarchs of the Caldwell family sat frozen in their seats, their mouths clamped shut. They were witnessing the total annihilation of their family's corporate legacy by a woman they had deemed unworthy to even attend the party. And as the new chairman of the board, I declared, my voice ringing with undeniable absolute authority. My first official act is a corporate restructuring. Preston Caldwell, you are hereby fired from your position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. You are terminated for gross financial mismanagement, predatory business practices, and orchestrating corporate fraud. You no longer own a company. You no longer have an executive title. You have absolutely nothing. Preston's knees buckled. He stumbled backward and collapsed into an empty chair at the front table. He buried his face in his hands, his perfectly styled blonde hair falling into disarray. The arrogant, condescending predator who had handed me $100 bill and told me to catch a cab back to the hood was gone. In his place sat a broken, bankrupt man who had just lost his entire empire on a stage he paid for. The demolition was complete. I had dismantled his wealth, his reputation, and his future in front of everyone he spent his life trying to impress. But the night was not quite over. There was still the matter of the authorities waiting in the wings. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavy, suffocating, and entirely broken by the sound of the heavy oak doors opening for a second time. The guests turned their heads, expecting hotel security to finally intervene. But the people walking down the center aisle of the Plaza Hotel were not wearing hotel uniforms. 6 men and 2 women entered the room, moving with a synchronized, unyielding purpose that instantly commanded the space. They did not wear tuxedos or evening gowns. They wore dark utilitarian suits, and clipped to their belts were the unmistakable gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was the white-collar crime division, and they had not come to attend a wedding. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern, weathered face, walked straight past the front tables, ignoring the gasps of the wealthy elite. He marched directly toward the stage, his eyes locked onto the broken man slumping in his chair. The string quartet had long since fled the stage, leaving only the sound of heavy footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Preston Caldwell, the lead agent, announced, his voice projecting clearly without the need for a microphone. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal bank fraud, and attempting to defraud the United States government through the Minority Business Enterprise Program. Stand up and put your hands behind your back. Preston did not move. He seemed physically incapable of processing the words. He looked toward his parents' table, his eyes wide and pleading, begging the Caldwell patriarch to step in and use their generational wealth to make this go away. But his father simply looked down at his empty plate, refusing to meet his son's eyes. His mother covered her face with a napkin. In the brutal, unforgiving world of old money, failure was a sin, but public humiliation was an absolute crime. They were cutting their losses and abandoning him instantly to protect their own reputations. Two federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Preston by the arms and hauling him to his feet. He offered no resistance as they pulled his arms behind his tailored suit jacket. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the quiet room. It was the sound of a dynasty ending. As they read him his Miranda rights, Preston finally looked at me. There was no arrogance left in his pale eyes, only a hollow, bottomless terror. They turned him around and marched him back down the center aisle, parading him in front of every single person he had tried to impress. As Preston was led away, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on my sister. Chloe let out a devastating guttural sob. Her legs gave out completely. The weight of the custom silk and lace gown seemed to drag her down to the floor. She collapsed in a heap of white fabric and shattered crystal, burying her face in her hands. She was crying for the loss of her imaginary fortune, the loss of her social status, and the terrifying realization that her signature was on those fraudulent federal documents. The FBI had not arrested her tonight, leaving her to marinate in the sheer terror of knowing they could knock on her door at any moment. I looked away from my sister and turned my attention to my mother. Valerie stood frozen near the edge of the stage. The shimmering emerald green gown now looked like a tragic costume on a disgraced actress. She was completely surrounded by her high society friends from the elite social clubs, but none of them were looking at her with admiration anymore. They were whispering behind their hands, taking collective steps backward, treating her like she was suddenly contagious. In less than 20 minutes, her entire social standing had been annihilated. She was no longer the proud matriarch of a wealthy family. She was the mother of a fraudster, a woman who mortgaged her home for a scam, a complete and utter pariah in the only world she ever cared about. Valerie looked around at the judgmental faces of her peers, panic rising in her chest. She realized she had nothing left. She had alienated her husband, destroyed her youngest daughter, and completely lost her place in society. In a final desperate act of self-preservation, she turned to the only person in the room who actually held any power. She took a shaky step toward me. The vicious, toxic pride that had defined her entire life was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate pleading. Nia, Valerie whispered, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face. Nia, please, you have to stop this. We are family. I am your mother. You cannot leave us like this. We will lose the house. Chloe will go to jail. Please, you have the money, you have the company, you can fix this. I will do anything you want. I will apologize. I will make it right. Just tell them you made a mistake. I stood perfectly still, looking at the woman who had drained my college fund, belittled my career, and kicked me out of her home just days prior. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The well of forgiveness had dried up years ago. I opened my black leather clutch. I bypassed my phone and my keys, reaching for the small folded piece of paper I had carried with me all week. I pulled out the crisp $100 bill. It was the exact same bill Preston Caldwell had shoved into my hand in the lobby of this very hotel, telling me to take a cab back to the hood, so I would not ruin his aesthetic. I held the bill between my fingers, letting Valerie see it. Then I let it go. The $100 bill fluttered down, landing softly on the head table right next to the puddle of spilled champagne and broken glass. Cab money for you all, I said, my voice cold, flat, and carrying a terrifying finality. Get out of my sight. I turned my back on my mother, ignoring the loud, racking sobs that erupted from her chest as she fell to her knees beside my sister. I walked down the steps of the stage and headed straight for the main exit. The sea of wealthy guests parted for me once again, but this time there were no whispers of confusion. There was only absolute terrified respect. They lowered their eyes as I walked past, recognizing the undisputed apex predator in the room. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and walked out into the grand lobby of the Plaza Hotel. I did not look back. I stepped through the revolving glass doors and out into the crisp, cool night air of Manhattan. My black Maybach was idling at the curb, the engine purring softly. My driver immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the quiet, luxurious leather interior, the chaos and the crying fading away entirely as the door clicked shut. Take me to the Vanguard building, I instructed my driver. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the glowing city traffic, I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers. I had entered this week as an invisible sister, constantly underestimated and relentlessly disrespected by the people who should have loved me most. I was leaving it as the undisputed master of my own universe. I had not just survived their toxic betrayal, I had weaponized it. I had burned their fraudulent kingdom to the ground and built my empire on the ashes. Let this be a lesson to anyone watching who is quietly enduring the weight of an ungrateful family or an arrogant enemy. Do not scream. Do not beg for their validation. Take their insults, take their underestimations, and use them as bricks to build your fortress. Because when the time finally comes to strike, you want them to be completely comfortable right up until the moment you take absolutely everything. This concludes my story. Thank you for being here, and remember, the best revenge is not just living well. The best revenge is total corporate acquisition.